just that they gave us the plastic.
Hi, everyone. My name is Curtis Head. I'm the CEO and co-founder of PRC Clinical. Mostly wanted to say thank you to you all for coming. This is actually our 6th ClinPulse event, our inaugural event in Boston. So we're hoping to have, to continue this here. All of our ClinPulse events have been, very interesting, very different. When we did this, we really wanted to provide a venue for for folks, like us that are kind of in the, day to day doing the trials, and provide a venue for kind of cross-functional, talking. So if you're with a CRO, with your, a sponsor company, there's a lot of issues. We've in the past focused on, e-consent or things like that, but it kind of comes down to enrollment. How do we actually, do the job we're hired to do? How do you, get this, get something through, to the market? How do you get done with your trial? So we found these events immensely helpful. They've all been different, all, really great dialogue. So we're looking forward to this panel. So thank you to the panel for being here. I want to say thank you to Olivier, to Joshua, and to Melanie for putting this together. There's a lot of work. This was a fantastic venue, but there's a lot of work that goes into, making this happen and getting us, right here. So I'm going to turn this over to Jeff, and we'll go from there. But thank you for coming.
Thank you. Just to echo what Curtis said, we're really grateful that all of you could make it here tonight, and we're happy to host this event with PRC. And a special thanks to the panel this evening for being able to get together and put this on. We're very excited about that. As PRC mentioned, SDC, as a partner to PRC, we are a specialized data services CRO focused on biostatistics and clinical data management, EDC, IRT, and clinical trials. We've been growing pretty well over the past several years, so much so that we decided to open an office in Waltham last May. And so we're happy to anchor down here, if you will. So really quickly, I'd like to give you a brief overview of what we can expect from today's panel meeting. We have one moderator and 4 panelists lined up for tonight's discussion on proactive patient enrollment strategies for clinical operations professionals. The moderator will pose questions and contribute to the discussions, and he may call on the audience for participation as well. This should last about 45 minutes, at which time we'll then open the floor up to the audience to ask questions to any of our speakers for the evening. The panel discussion should wrap up around 7:45, and of course, we invite you to stay a bit longer to network and enjoy a beautiful setup the folks here at Catalyst have brought us this evening. And now I will introduce you to Dr. Bryce Warren. He is our moderator for this evening's event. Dr. Warren is presently a consultant in the pharmaceutical and device space. He is also currently the vice chairman of the board of the Histiocytosis Association. And he's also the chairman of the Medical and Science Advisory Committee to the Histiocytosis Society. Most recently, he was the chief science officer at Atlantic Research Group in Charlottesville, Virginia. And he is a past president and board member of the Society of Clinical Research, SOCRA. Co-founder of the Arkansas Center for Bleeding Disorders at Arkansas Children's Hospital and the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences. And so now I'll hand it over to Dr. Bryce Warren.
Thank you, Jeff. I'll just use that one. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. It's always weird to hear your bio, And now what I get to do is I get to read their bios. So let's make fun of them, shall we? But first off, I have some things. People are a little bit scared of when I moderate something with probably for good reason. And so I have some points here, and I'm supposed to thank you for being here, and that's easy to do. I really do appreciate you being here. And at the end, I want us to be able to ask some questions and ask the panel some things, and maybe some things that stick out as we go through some bullet points. And I don't know if you were given those bullet points, but if you don't have them, it's fine. I'm going to do them anyway, whether you have them or not. So I'm going to introduce the panel now. So I'm going to start with Melissa Price. That's her, I hope, raising her hand. Well done, Melissa. She's currently the Vice President of Clinical Development at Taurus Biomedical. She leads the development of TAR, or is it TAR 200? How would you like it said? All right, we'll go with that. In bladder cancer for the urology-focused company based in Lexington. Prior to relocating to the Boston area in 2016, she was the Vice President of Product Development at Heat Biologics. And Heat Biologics is a startup immuno-oncology company, and she was responsible for the overall accountability for the regulatory, clinical, CMC, and quality functions there. Before she joined Heat, Melissa served as Vice President Global FSP Solutions at the global CRO INC Research in the role of Business Unit Head for a global large pharma partnership. She holds a PhD in organic chemistry from Yale. I'll be marking that off. Melissa brings an integrated perspective of the science of drug development with the operational execution, having spent 17 years in the industry in both biotech and the CRO space. Melissa Price. Thank you. Our next panelist is named Roger Nolan. I'll let you guess which one Roger is. He's the president and co-founder and chief operating officer at BioCure. It's in Research Triangle. He holds positions with consulting groups, clinical strategies and tactics, and MedSurg, who work with entrepreneurs and startup and early-stage biotech companies to advance their products. He has experience in management of preclinical and clinical drug development programs, regulatory strategy interactions, financing and outsourcing to specialist service providers, including CROs. Specific areas of expertise are diabetes, oncology, anti-infectives, cardiovascular indications. He's held several positions inside of this business that we're all in, and senior director, a senior scientist, director of pharmacology, and an assistant professor at a medical school. He has a PhD in pharmacology and biochemistry from Melbourne University, so he's going to be very difficult to understand, even more so than me. I'd like to welcome Roger Nolan. Next panelist is Carol Ann McEvoy. She's a clinical study manager at PRC Clinical. She focuses primarily on phase 1 studies in the neurology therapeutic area. Carol has a strong background in clinical ops at pharma and medical device sponsors, CROs, and academic institutions, including, but not just these, Janssen, Jazz, Icon, and other CNS companies since acquired, such as Sepacor and IDEC Pharmaceuticals. Carol's originally from the Massachusetts area, but she traded that, for some reason, for Palo Alto, California. Must be the sun. Anyway, she brings to the table 20 years of experience in clinical operations, and so welcome, Carol. Faith Kolb, which I actually practiced her last name, Kolb. You would think that it would be easy for me, but it's not. She's a vice president of biometric operations at SDC. She's based in their new office, SDC's new office in Waltham. It opened earlier this year, that's right. She's got 20 years of experience in the industry. She's covered responsibilities in data services, technology solutions, clinical operations, and much more. Some of her former positions, vice president of biometrics at Veristat, worldwide head, DM, and biostatistics early phase at Parexel, senior director at Prometrica, chief technical officer at Varian International, and she does bring a very unique perspective as a data services and technology expert with some direct clinical ops experience. So welcome, Faith Kolb. So you can see we've got a panel that has I'm Bryce Warren, by the way. So you can see that we have a panel that has a lot of experience, fairly, hopefully wide-ranging. Hopefully that we can get some answers for you, because that's why we're here. It really isn't an exercise in us spending a Thursday night together, although that's fine. It is Thursday, I got that right? Okay. So we've come up with some talking points, and we'll go through these. I think that this hits a fairly wide wide range of issues that we all face. And then at the end, we'll have some time and maybe ask some specific questions. So to Carol and to Faith go the first question. What do you need? Do you need something?
No, we're good.
Okay. All right. Need a question. Okay. So it's around drift and wobble. And what we mean by that is tracking, enrollment progress and hitting goals or not hitting goals. So that's sort of the drift and wobble aspect of it. And the question is, what operational metrics and site quality metrics are the most valuable? And that's, when I say that out loud, it sounds like a question that's just written on a piece of paper. But I know, and it was actually right there. But also, there's something particularly important about leading off with that particular question. When we're talking about operational metrics, we're talking about quality metrics. Talk a little bit about the value of those things.
Is this on? Yes, well, good. So I guess I'll first start off with how important it is to engage your team early in the discussion of performance metrics. And I think, being on the CRO side for so many years, that sponsors typically ask, first off, how many metrics are in your EDC system? And can you track number of patients and number of data entered and numbers queries and number AEs? And those are important status metrics. They truly are. But they don't tell the whole story when it comes to proactive enrollment strategies. There are a few that really should be the focus early in startup, and those are the eligibility and site compliance metrics. Okay, very, very important. What are the number or percent of screen failures? And what is the reason for those screen failures, right? Has all the eligibility criteria been met for a patient? If not, why, right? Are we missing key safety and efficacy data? And why, right? Protocol deviations. Does my site, I'm a CRA, does my site have a protocol deviation, right? And what is it? Okay, and there's probably even a few more that I'm missing. But I would certainly encourage that those metrics include those compliance metrics early on. And then ask yourself, don't just track them, right? If you go to a meeting and Susie says, oh yeah, we got 20 of these and 30 of those and 40 of those, you need to get into the detail and action, right? Come up with an action. Even if your action early on is do nothing because it's the first time and it's okay. I know what happened with this particular situation. At least have that discussion and action it. So don't just track action. Really, for proactive enrollment strategies, focus on those eligibility and compliance metrics.
I agree with Faith, but I'd also like to say that site selection is really important. And in this day and age of everything being electronic, there's a lot of data mining that can be done in advance of actually bringing a site on. There's been several sites that, during site selection, they would say, yes, we can do a query of our database to see how many patients that we have that meet this particular eligibility criteria. And they do that, and they come up with thousands and thousands of patients. But then when you really drill down, it's not quite that many, and then you bring them on, and it's still not quite that many. But that's where sort of the pre-screening logs and the active communication with the site and querying them regarding what approaches they're taking to recruiting patients is really important. So it's open communication. Tell me how you're actually talking to the patients. Are you using phrases or just words that are turning the patients off to the study, or either triggering interest, or just the minute things that can either influence and of course we know in clinical research we don't want to influence. There has to be free will and entirely informed consent. But it is important to enroll, of course. And
I think I'm guilty of all those things at some point. I was an academic for a long time, and I left that out of the bio because I thought it would put you to sleep. But was at an HTC. I was a co-founder. Well, Jeff did say, of a hemophilia treatment center. in University of Arkansas, and we saw primarily, we were located at Arkansas Children's Hospital on the ground, so we saw, it's a comprehensive care model. So all these things that you're saying, when we would have industry trials, that's what we referred to them then, like, let's say something like NOVA, or some bleeding, some recombinant factor. That was the other thing, long-acting factors or longer-acting factors. We would do what you were saying too, and we would query our database, and we'd come up with, War and Peace, of what we had. But oftentimes those didn't really translate into enrollments. And that didn't make us a bad site, I don't think, but it made us, I don't know, what would you, I mean, is there someone here who's had a similar experience? Are there sites here, in the audience, and raise your hand if you want to say something, but that the things that we've talked about, these, just on this first question, resonate with you? There's some, because they certainly do me. I know that I'm guilty of these things, and I wasn't even trying to be. Just lucky, I suppose. But being able to identify what those, what those shortcomings are is one thing, but being able to do anything about them is something completely different.
Do you mind? I'm going to go back to Carol's comment, though, on qualification, right? Absolutely key. And there's so much technology out there today, and if you think how the sites have matured over the last few years, you can actually say your sites are technically savvy, right? Mm-hmm. Could you do that a few years ago? I couldn't, certainly not, right? So there's so much technology now to support that qualification process, and it's absolutely key. There's electronic health records, right? And as you go out for that visit, your site may say, sure, I've got 6 patients per month for you. I've got it, no problem. I've looked in my database, and say, hey, can you show me how you derive that, right? Or let's search it together, right? The electronic health records used to be PDF, right? Oh, how helpful was that? Not really, right? You can actually search them now, right? You can put in primary and secondary diagnoses codes. You can look at ages and genders and even specific lab values. It's a tremendous resource at the qualification time, right, to secure that enrollment rate, to know it's feasible, right, for your study before you actually select them, and found out later they kind of were a little bit overestimating that rate.
Melissa, do you have a...
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think, oftentimes we'll choose a site because they did a good job on a previous study, and either that's the sponsor has that experience or the CRO has that experience. And oftentimes it's not really the exact same population, but we go to that site and we ask them to look at their database. They say, oh, yeah. But your point about being able to query databases, I think the paradigm is changing or starting to change. There's companies, actually a small company here in Cambridge, who they have networks of a bunch of institutions that you can query all of their EMRs simultaneously on the basis of eligibility parameters that are in your protocol. So you can actually choose a site to start talking to on the basis of, do they have these patients on the basis of the technology, as opposed to identifying the site in another way and then saying, do they have patients? Instead, you're kind of backing up that selection and choosing, identifying the sites on the basis of whether they have the patients first, rather than who do you already know. So that's just something that it's not prime time, everywhere, but there's companies working on that, and I think making some good progress there.
And we certainly can't look at everything because we don't really have the right to, so we have to look at the right things.
And that's a good point, though. We should preface that there are, regulations we have to adhere to, patient privacy and confidentiality, but you can do more, and that's the point, with data mining, right, with all the different technology options.
So let's move on to this sort of a related question, and it says, how to identify an underperforming site before it's too late? I was never guilty of that. It was always too late.
Well, thankfully, with the invention of EDC and the reporter modules, it's really easy to use the reporter tool and to look into the database every single day and create a custom report and see exactly where a site is at any given moment. And if you know what their enrollment metrics are, you can run a report and you can see, okay, you're 5 days late for entering that particular patient's data, or why haven't you enrolled 10 patients by now since we've queried your database and you had 100 million patients that meet the eligibility criteria, so what's going on here? You can also look at their performance regarding queries, which marking group has open queries and whose responsibility it is to answer it. So it's a lot easier remotely to look at how a site is performing. So I would never say it makes monitoring obsolete, but it certainly makes the monitor's job a lot easier, especially if the in-house team is looking at it in advance and then they alert the monitor to what's going on and say, hey, we noticed that site 123 has enrolled 3 patients, but they only have 1 patient entered in the database and they have 50 queries open, and can you, give them a call and have them address these things before you even go out there for your monitoring visit. So the other positive side effect of that is that it actually decreases the amount of time that the monitor needs to be on site, thus saving money. And I know that's not quite the topic that we're talking about tonight, but there's just
No,
all
we
sorts
don't.
of,
We don't care about money.
no. But there's just
whatsoever.
all sorts of positive side effects being a pun, of having this electronic system or capabilities that we have nowadays to look at things remotely.
And it's always as a site. Are there any other sites or former sites or any? Is it me versus the world here? Is there? Okay, good. All right, there's a few. Thank you. We'll talk later. So, as a former PI on some of these things, when I hear customer report being referred to as a customer report generated on me, or talking about days late and calling me, those are super fun calls to get. When it's not the only set of affairs you have to address in a day, and you've got 20 or 30 studies, and you've got patients in all different manner of malady and sickness. It's being able to use technology. I think that's what we're talking about in this next thing, is being able to use technology in a way that's mutually beneficial for all of you and for the few of us here that are a site. Let's talk just for a second about technology. And we've had some alphabet soup here. We've said EDC and some other things. Talk about just for a second, and anywhere, Faith, if you want to jump in here, when you're talking about technology and how it fits into the equation, and I'm going to say the equation is about enrollment because that's the primary ethos around this gathering tonight. So EHR, EDC, IRT, any other letters you want to say out loud. How do you think it fits?
First of all, technology's everywhere, right? And that's the good news, right? And sometimes there's maybe too much of it, but there's EDC, EHR, CTMS, EPRO, eSource, investigator databases, and I know I'm missing some. But I think the absolutely important perspective here is to use them. Right? Look back at sorry, I did miss one. SDTM, right? We have standard formats now for our data for analysis, right? So there's a lot of data. So definitely leverage the information you have, the information on previous trials, right? Mine it. Ask your team members. Many of your team members have worked in the industry for many years. They've worked within that indication. What are the trends? What have they seen? And really then, if you don't leverage technology, then you're really missing an opportunity. And again, when it comes to proactive enrollment strategies, especially, to help ensure that the sites are going to hit that target, right? It's the number one reason for study delays, right? So really, really leverage whatever you can and inquire to your team members. They hold a tremendous amount of experience.
Roger, I was going to ask you a question here really quick. So when you're talking to early stage folks, or not necessarily early, maybe slightly less than that, where are you advising people to start thinking about technology and how technology might impact a clinical test or trial or even an entire developmental program?
Right. So I haven't worked in the CRO industry for several years. I've been involved in a lot of smaller startup companies lately, and a lot of those companies do small trials, single site maybe. And a lot of that, getting back to Melissa's comment earlier, there are different reasons for selecting sites. They might be previously high-performing sites, which can bring in its own problems. There may be large competition for trials then, and sometimes the smaller companies can get overlooked. I have a small startup company myself, so a lot of my comments will be personal experience. We've selected a couple of sites based on special procedures they have. For example, we wanted to deliver a drug colonically, so we went to a GI clinic, but it was a diabetes trial. So some of the, getting back to the technology part of it, this site, was not very accustomed to using the latest electronic technology. So we had to adapt to use them. We trained them to do maybe fax in their reports.
So let me ask you this. Did they know that they weren't adept at technology, or did they think that they were?
Yeah, I mean, they didn't have they didn't have IRT and EDC as we know it for large trials for CROs. So, but luckily the trial was small enough, and we had a pretty experienced clinical development person. We were able to train them up and make do. But as far as the recruitment side of it goes, it was a 10-patient, two-way crossover trial. So we basically, and it was down in eastern North Carolina. And again, the patient database, again, dictates a lot of how you recruit. I mentioned this on one of our earlier calls. We were recruiting patients in type 2 diabetes, and obviously slightly different demographic to a lot of patients. They were in eastern North Carolina, they were older, bit lower socioeconomic status. So one of our, as a funny aside, one of our recruitment campaigns was me going live on a gospel station, radio station, out of Greenville, North Carolina.
Is that right?
And there was a guy. Yeah, well, it worked. I mean, people were calling in saying, "Yeah, my dad would like to be in that trial." But as I was talking, there was this older lady who was interviewing me. I had meticulously made notes driving down there to give her a list of questions.
I'm making note of this gospel aspect.
She said, "Forget the notes, I'll do all the talking."
Okay, all right.
And there was the guy behind the glass screen with the headphones on playing music, and it was a new experience. But that's getting back to the old days. But some sites, as you were saying, just aren't up with the latest technology, and I certainly haven't worked on large trials for a while, so I haven't had a personal experience with IRT, for example. But there are different reasons for picking sites, and for small startup companies, these might be some of the considerations you have.
Melissa, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, we're talking about technology, and I don't want to be anti-technology because I'm definitely not. But I think, using technology will tell you might identify that someone's not enrolling like you wanted them to enroll, but it doesn't tell you anything about why or what to do about it. And so you can't just expect a computer to help you solve all these problems. You still have to have the face-to-face interaction with human beings at the site. And I think that's something that I think we're sort of focusing more on the technology, and we should, but maybe not to the expense of the human interaction, because these are sites that have so many things going on, many balls in the air. You were saying, "Oh, that's a call I really want to get." And maybe you don't call them. Maybe you go visit them and you get them face to face and you look them in the eye and you say, "What's going on? You were so excited about this. You told me you had so many patients." And maybe they just haven't really been thinking about it, and now all of a sudden they are thinking about it. Or maybe their practice patterns have changed recently. You don't know all those things, and you can't get those answers from a computer. And especially for the sites who aren't tech savvy and don't really want to put all this stuff in a system all the time, you got to be able to work with them too. So, I think we have to continually be in front of people. I mean, this is still at the end of the day a people business, and can't forget that while technology can help us a lot, and I do really think that a lot of the things that technology is giving us are helpful, but we can't forget that we're still dealing with people.
Yeah, I think face-to-face is, I mean, it's obvious that it works because we're here. And they've paid a lot of money for this opportunity. But do make note of the fact that Melissa is anti-technology. Just write that there. She probably
My
learned
first
that also
comment
at
was
Yale.
actually about technology.
I
so.
know. Still making that note. So you had a question back here.
So is there a system that can look across clinical sites to see which are performing better, which are not, are enrolling better, which are not, and maybe it's something in the inclusion-exclusion criteria that's particularly sticky?
That's a good word. I like sticky. Were y'all able to hear? Okay.
There's multiple answers to that question, and it's a very good question. One of the core systems, though, are the more modern-day EDC systems, okay? They have evolved with functionality. So many now, although they used to not historically, you can actually track within them your pre-screening activity, your screening activity, all the way through to termination of your patients. However, it's as good as the data put into the system, right? So we can't forget that. So again, early on in that qualification process, initiating your sites, you really need to work with them and make sure they're committed to report that information, right, in a timely fashion. But if you capture that information in your EDC system, you absolutely have access to it every single day via reports or your own queries, and you can take action. Even if it's just one reason someone's screen failed out, you know what it is, and you can take action of it. So technology, again, although I am going to later heavily focus on relationships because that's key too. But with technology today, there's so much information you have and so much information to be actioned.
So, Faith, I have a question, which for my benefit, maybe the questioner. So, for example, if there is a screen failure, do these systems tell you, for example, which inclusion criteria they failed, which exclusion criteria? Can you go through and make amendments on the
Absolutely.
fly?
You can list them right out, and then it really is the team's responsibility to then action it, to know what it is, what caused it, what you can do to prevent the next one, right?
Hey, what about the cost of a screen failure? What's the cost of a screen failure compared to pre-screening stuff?
What's the cost of delaying enrollment for a year and a half? Okay, but it's a good point. You do pay a little bit more, okay? Not significant, right? And you can actually design the systems, et cetera, so you don't even capture every one, just the reason, right? And then list those out and action them. You have a whole bunch of options. But you're right, it costs a little more, but then at the end of the day, if you hit enrollment, how wonderful is that?
Sure. Yeah. Question.
This is, I guess, in response to the inclusion-exclusion criteria question, and actually sort of almost like what we're talking about, but I need to say it, which is that on the industry side, we don't spend enough time really thinking about those exclusion criteria.
That's
right. We
right.
are very concerned about endpoints. We are very concerned about our data. We are very concerned about all these things. But the exclusion criteria, we write them down, and so I have started talking to the physicians, and when they say, you need to have been diagnosed within 12 months, so I say, how about 14? Okay, that'd be fine. How about 16? Yeah, that'd be good too. So we don't spend enough time, we kill ourselves with the exclusion. And so I'm just encouraging everybody that if you're on the industry side, really question those exclusion criteria.
And the clinical experience of the patient also has to be figured in here. You know, what's reasonable, what's expected. Yes, thank you for your question. But you know, the clinical experience of the patient needs to be figured in. You know, when you're talking about inclusion and exclusion criteria, you know, how sick are these folks? Are they pediatric?
But to Jamie's point, too, on exclusion criteria, I actually happened to just come across an article the other day, and over the past 6-10 years, exclusion criteria has increased by 60%.
Yeah, there's 35 exclusion criteria in a study.
Now, some of it's necessary, right? Because we've learned more about the patient population, and you really do want to target that. But some of it's just because you copied it over from your old treatment protocol 6 years ago, and you think it still applies.
Faith, I think it's because we're trying to write the perfect protocol that's going to protect us from this, that, and this. But if you want to get patients in, you're going to have to take a little risk.
Absolutely.
Understand the patient.
I'd just like to say that my mother got really mad at me the other day.
Is this
Because-
unusual, Carol?
No.
I postulate that it is not.
And it has to do with Jamie's comment. And she said, why don't drug companies let people in studies? They're trying to design the perfect patient. Why isn't my dad, her husband, why can't he get in a study? And I had to explain to her the reason why is it's the biostatistician's fault. Sorry. Because in order to bring the drug to market as quickly as possible, you have to control your data as much as possible. So therefore, that increases the inclusion-exclusion criteria, which unfortunately decreases your ability for enrollment. But it narrows the population, and it makes the data more precise so that you can actually meet your endpoints. And in clinical studies or clinical research nowadays, everyone works backwards. They work backwards from what is the message that we want to give to the FDA, and what endpoints do we want to meet, and how do we want to power our studies so that we can say that this drug actually is efficacious and safe. And in order to do that, they very often have to control it more tightly, so they delete a whole bunch of people from the population, and therefore my mother's mad at me. Yes.
Sorry about that, Carol Ann. Just on that point, there's the phase 2 versus phase 3 dilemma too. In phase 2, that's often a company's last chance to show some efficacy. So they've got to select the patient population very carefully to show p less than 0.05 on a certain indication. Then with a pivotal phase 3 study, you've got to take more all-comers. So you get a good look at safety, percent of patients that respond. So that's important too. And, like I said, for small companies doing their make or break phase 2, they've got to make sure it's just right.
Especially when their funds are very limited, because research is very expensive, and it's the venture capitalists who are funding research nowadays. And so therefore the time to bring a drug to market has to be compressed. And then, of course, there has to be a return on their investment. And so there's just so many factors involved in drug development that the general public doesn't know about. And I think, to get back to my mother being angry at me point, is that I think there's a lot of, I'm not quite sure what the word is, but just across the general population, distrust of clinical trials. Yeah. And sort of, Roger, to go a little bit, or to emphasize a little bit more about what you were talking about going on the gospel channel, is that you really need to know your niche market. You need to know who you're talking to. You can't just advertise on the radio and expect that the people are going to show up at your door. You have to drill down and figure out what is the behavior and the thinking of the people that you're trying to reach in a particular socioeconomic market or a particular cultural market, and just figure it out. And then, in addition to that, even at the sites, if you have an underperforming site, what are they doing? For example, are they, the referral network, are they, getting to the patients too late after they've already made a decision to go down this path? Why? Then you have to change their mind to get into a clinical trial. Whereas if you reach them before they've made a decision, then they think, okay, there's this versus this, and so therefore you don't have to try to change their mind.
Right.
So
good point.
Yeah.
Just one quick point. These gospel station listeners didn't have email or Facebook either. So,
Did you have a question over here?
Yeah,
go
I
ahead.
have a question. We know for the metrics, you said EDC lots of importance, but I think the patient review about site, is there any way patient can rate it like site, some reviews or some back? So this is the good, patient knows what they get from the site,
Well, unfortunately, even in huge phase 3 pivotal studies, there's very limited sites per geographic area. There's 50 states in the country, and of course there's also the EU and Latin America, Australia, and
You see what I'm talking
there may
about?
be, one site per state, if that. And but there's places like ClinTrials.gov or TrialFinder or even Facebook, where patients can find clinical trials or advocacy groups. But there's not really a way that a patient can rate a site. But they do, so patients do have to be more savvy nowadays. They need to know how to contact their primary care physician, Dr. Interwebs, and do the analysis and look at the current therapies that are available versus what is the positive versus the negative participating in this trial, and even look at the pharmaceutical companies and how it's being managed. So yes, that is actually a really good point, and patients are becoming more savvy nowadays because of the internet.
So let's talk really quickly about how to talk about, well, it's written here as the Zen of enrollment. It's hard to think of enrollment as Zen-like, but when you're talking about passing on, and we've identified some things that are difficult, and this is a difficult way and place to earn a living. It really is, but it's a wonderful one. I mean, you think about all the stuff that we get to do. It is properly difficult, but it's also really rewarding. So maybe some Zen there, but when you're talking about passing on what some people refer to as lessons learned, even from past studies about enrollment, and how do you translate, I guess maybe failures, but also successes from one clinical test or trial to maybe the next one, or one that's underperforming, since we're talking about enrollment, and anybody who wants to take that one.
I think I might take this from a slightly different angle,
Sure.
but for the Zen of enrollment and really sustained focus, team members have invested a lot of time, right? Feasibility, qualification, initiation, green light, go, right? But it's not over. Okay, the sites need tremendous amount of support, and this is where the continue to build that relationship, assist them, find out, where they are struggling, how can you help, is absolutely important. And I want to share a real case study here. I had the opportunity with a ClinOps team several years ago to rescue an osteoarthritis trial, okay? 20 sites were initiated, 180 patients enrolled, 180 patients to go, 12 months over already on enrollment, another 12 months predicted to complete enrollment. The ClinOps team went through the transition. They enrolled that study in 4 months. How'd we do it?
You made it up.
That's right. That's right. There was no magic pixie dust here or anything, right? Unfortunately, the previous CRO we rescued from, they did a fantastic job. They did pick the right 20 sites. But what they did is they didn't have the bandwidth and that communication and relationship and time. They had experienced turnover to follow up with those sites. So when we leveraged our CRA crew and sent them out there, they came back with, you would not believe what they came back with, right? One site didn't even know we were still enrolling, okay? Another site's there, oh, great, well, I've had these questions outstanding. They just needed that attention, right? They needed to know what was going on, how they were doing, where is the study at, okay? So qualification to me is still key. I'm an oldie. I'm going back to the oldies but goodies, okay? But after that, that relationship and support to the sites is absolutely fantastic.
So one solution does not fit all.
Absolutely not, right? And they did have to adjust. What does each site need, and address it as quickly as possible. And I'll tell you, we over-enrolled by 6 because we didn't expect to move so fast, but I'd rather have that problem than the other.
So can I ask a question? Sorry.
Don't be sorry. I like the
Okay, I don't mean to hijack this, but so I come from the industry side. but I also come from ultra rare and rare disease side, which is huge in Cambridge and the surrounding areas. And so I'd like to understand from your perspective, because I do agree with what Faith has said in terms of, qualification, but also doing the right feasibility, drilling down on the inclusion-exclusion to make sure these sites have patients as opposed to them going in their database and saying, yeah, I have 20 patients that have hemophilia A. Well, that's great, but do any of them have inhibitors? And they can't be on my study. So, but looking at and thinking about ultra rare and rare diseases, which are really hard, can be really hard to enroll even when you know the right doctors and have qualified them left and right. Have any of you worked on those kind of studies, and can you give us any pearls of wisdom or lessons learned?
I'm just going to give you an example of something that's worked for us. I wouldn't call it an ultra rare, but it's a population that's very difficult to find. And one of the things that we've done is we've brought on a clinical science liaison role into the company. So CRA team has a great role to play on the study, but oftentimes their focus is certainly in the U.S. I'll come back to the EU part, but certainly in the U.S., especially with all of the technology that's coming on board, the CRA role has become more of an auditor role and a data management, not in the traditional data management sense, but looking at the data in the EDC as opposed to either site relationship or a more scientific-based role. And so what we found is pairing CRAs up with a company employee that's a clinical science liaison, where their role is to go out and talk more on the relationship side, understanding the patient flow, what's their referral networks, how can we help them reach out to other people that are near them. That has actually been very valuable to us. It's helped us sort of understand a little bit more about what the challenges are, because that person will spend maybe the whole day in the clinic with them. CRAs don't have the bandwidth to do that usually, nor do they necessarily have that same skill set. Some do, some I don't want to be too general, but I think there is a sort of a separate role that is more helpful in disease indications that are hard to accrue, where those sites need more hand-holding, where you need more sort of individual problem-solving potentially. That's just one thing that's worked well for us.
Well, I applaud you for doing that, and I don't want to hijack this, but being in the rare disease and ultra rare disease space, there are different ways of doing it. And if you don't have the CRA who has that bandwidth or the ability, and I know they're very few and far between, that's a great adjunct. There's also the medical science liaisons, as I've heard from other companies that, one in particular, one person pointed out to me, oh, well, our medical science liaison, has the relationship with the site and should be at the site initiation visit and whatnot. And having been on both sides of that, I can see it. So I appreciate that and glad to see that's happening. Thank you.
For me, the MSL was always a welcomed visit. And generally, I think I also was in the rare disease space, in the ultra rare space, even factor 10 deficient or dysfunctional patients. And MSL for those indications can often be very helpful, especially around, like we're talking about enrollment today, but we're talking about also keeping patients on study properly, getting to the end, and hopefully moving that molecule to market such that more people can then benefit from it. So it's super important. Roger, did you want to say anything about MSLs and in your experience? I noticed that you were sort of fidgeting over there when we started talking about it.
Fired up over there?
Not exactly.
Okay, well,
I'd like to just help
Sure.
one aspect, because I totally agree with what Melissa said, and I've seen that work very, very well, especially if you've got a site with a couple patients in whatever, Uzbekistan, right? If you have that centralized expert who can go out there and meet up with that regional CRA who's got the local regulations and the language, that's a wonderful team approach. But in the ultra rare, there's another aspect too, and that is you have to expand your enrollment approach. So use the patient patient advocacy, the networking, understand, why are patients not necessarily engaged in clinical trials too? Is it fear? Do they need more discussion, awareness, and information at another level? Is it logistics? Can you help get them there, right, to the trial? And a very common one for rare disease, right, is misdiagnosis or non-diagnosis at all. And then guess what? You might be working, and I had the opportunity with a local biotech to have a recruitment strategy for physicians and then your enrollment strategy for patients, right? So educational events, seminars, networking, helping them better identify those key signs and symptoms, right? To get the physicians more knowledge, so then you can get the patients as well.
And going to that diagnosis, so I've worked at a couple of rare disease companies where, the diagnosis and getting the right diagnosis is always the issue. So engaging that third party who can help you diagnose those patients, because most of the time in a genetic condition, you need a genetic mutation to be specific, or the specific gene mutation. For example, I worked in XLHED, so there's a bigger group and there are many different genes, but this was a very specific one. So having that third party who can help you with the genetic counseling and the genetic testing is really key for those areas.
So we've talked about the importance of face-to-face. It's kind of like what we're doing here. We've talked about engaging PIs, and and also there's an engagement of the sub-Is. I've been that as well, and it's certainly helpful. Understanding the patient experience and patient flow, understanding what this patient is, what their clinical experience is like, when they come to the hospital, what's going to happen to them. But we've spoken about that, and we've mentioned the fact that trials and tests aren't only done in the United States, but they're done globally. So let's take a few minutes and talk about how what we know works in the U.S. might or might not work in the EU or other places. When we're talking about rare conditions, where are we sometimes finding our patients? Eastern Europe. Everywhere. So those experiences that they have are very different than the experiences that we have in our clinics. And how do we communicate better with those sites? Cultural differences, certainly time differences. If you're in a global trial, you're never off. You get one day off a year, and that's like Christmas, because when you're asleep, they're awake, and when they're awake, you're asleep. So it's all the time. So let's talk just for a few minutes about some of the challenges in conducting trials outside the U.S. I know everybody's looking back at me and saying, what do we do now? Come on, Raj.
I'll start, because I mentioned that earlier about the CRL role. So I've found that there is a difference in how the CRA role is evolving in the US versus in Europe, for example, where a lot of the CRAs in Europe are physicians. And so they typically have a slightly different skill set than you'd find in the US, in the sense that, my comment about in the US, the CRAs tend to seem to be evolving more toward an auditor role, and maybe less on the science side, whereas in Europe it's kind of the opposite. And so in that case, you might even need to partner your CRA in Europe with somebody who is more accustomed to looking at the database and leveraging the technology, but it's still a team approach. And so that was one of the things that we've sort of identified, is that our CRA team in Europe has a different skill set just by training than in the U.S. And it's not better or worse, it's just different. And so needing to understand that. I think the other piece is the local language and the understanding of the customary way of doing business is so important that you may not be able to do that as effectively from the U.S. And so working with someone who does have boots on the ground, who understands how people like to operate. I'll give you an example of, for example, in Korea, you actually need to go face-to-face, visit a site 4 times before you're going to get them on board. You would never do that in the U.S. You'd send them an email, and you want to do this trial? Great, okay, let's go. It doesn't work that way. So you won't get anywhere in Korea if you're trying to approach it in that same way that you would normally approach it in the U.S. So I think working with teams who know how to do that locally and really letting them sort of lead that with you coming along for the ride has worked in the past for me.
So we've got about 5 minutes left for this part of the discussion, and then we'll open it up to some more questions if you'd like. So what I wanted to do is, since we haven't been able to cover all these points, and they're, because it's big, it's a lot bigger than an hour, honestly. What are some things that each of you would like to talk about that we haven't touched on thus far? We can start anywhere. You know what? We'll start with you, Roger.
Well, I think we talked about inclusion and exclusion criteria. Thank you. And maybe there are a couple of points we didn't touch. And from personal experience, recent personal experience, we were planning to do a clinical trial at a single site we picked them because they had KOLs. They gave us the good government rate because we had a grant, and said they could see a lot of patients. And of course, the same old story. When we delved into it a bit deeper, they couldn't promise that many patients, and the study was going to take 2 years. So we changed the protocol. Instead of doing three parallel groups of 15 patients, we are now seriously considering a 10-patient, two-way crossover trial, which, according to our statisticians, can be just as powerful and maybe even more powerful. So you only have to recruit 10 patients now instead of 45. Still takes a fair while because there's a long washout period between the two visits, but you're more likely to get 10 patients than 45. That's just a personal experience we came up with lately. And again, it's for a small company, single site, but those kind of things can be determined up front if you do all the things that my panel members have suggested. We were guilty of not doing all of them. So I'm also telling you things what not to do, but it's good to know in retrospect for future use.
Thank you.
The one other thing I wanted to bring up is that I think the latest data that I've heard is that only 3% of eligible patients contribute to clinical trials. And so why is that, and what can we do to fix that?
Did you say 3?
3 is what I've heard, yeah.
You mean out of the whole population?
Yeah.
Wow.
And so...
You said of eligible patients. 3% of potentially eligible patients.
Yes. So the question is, why is it so small? That doesn't speak to your point about we're excluding a lot of patients. But I think part of it is that there's a relatively limited number of sites that do clinical research. And there's a whole lot of patients out there who don't have good access to those sites, or who may not want to leave their primary care physician to go somewhere else. And even if it's only 12 miles up the road, they have a relationship with that doctor. They don't want to go somewhere else. So, I think being able to bring research to a broader number of investigative sites could help some of that, because I think there's a lot of patients that we're just not catching. How you do that is a different story. I know there is one startup company that I'm familiar with who is looking to basically bring the whole research function to regular clinics so that the physician is doing just clinical care like they would do all the time. And this company is bringing all that research infrastructure. So they bring the coordinator, they do all the data entry. I think that model is an interesting one. It's not ready for prime time, probably in a large scale yet, but
is it is it a box that you drop inside of the clinic?
Yes,
is it like a
exactly.
Subway in a gas station?
Exactly. Yeah. But I think, conceptually, it's a really interesting idea, right? It allows physicians to continue to do what they want to do every day, which is clinical care of their patients, without the research administrative burden. There's a lot of people who would want to do research, but the administrative challenges of bringing that into their practice is a lot. And so if you can sort of outsource that piece, maybe that allows you to bring trials to more sites than you can right now. So I think that's something that is intriguing to me that I hope sticks, and maybe we'll see the paradigm changing over time there.
Thank you.
One topic that we have on our list is regarding picking the right CRO, the right sponsor-CRO relationship. Not all sponsors, use CROs. And I've been on both sides of it, and actually I've mostly been on the sponsor side. I have worked at a large CRO, and now with PRC I work at a smaller sort of boutique CRO. And I think just developing that relationship for the sponsor is, looking for the right fit is really important. If it's a huge phase 3 pivotal study and a huge sponsor, of course they probably need a big, huge CRO that has the 50 CRAs in the field. But also, it's important to look for a CRO that has sort of a can-do attitude and that can think out of the box and get creative and not just follow a formula, which a lot of CROs do. And a lot of sponsors do as well. So it's really important for sponsors to interview very carefully, and also for themselves to think outside of the box and ask the very unique questions to really get down to the feel and the culture of the CRO, the people that they're going to be working with, and to meet the people they're going to be working with and find out about their attitudes about clinical trials and enrollment in general, and how invested they are. Because even though you work at a CRO, you still care just as much as you do as if you're at a sponsor. And as clinical research professionals, we actually really care about what we're doing. We really, really care. And just because you work at a CRO doesn't mean you're a step back from caring about it, at least from my perspective. So I think that's something to consider also, that sponsors should look for, is cultivating that relationship and looking for the right CRO and making sure that the CRO matches the study and can actually do and come to the bid defense with some problem solving, thinking outside of the box, and how can we get this done type of solutions in advance.
And I guess I'll probably conclude with just saying how important it is, to engage early, and that, enrollment is a cross-functional sport, okay? The team wins or loses together, okay? So I know quick is important, quick. But if you take the time up front, right, engage each of the functions, right, and some of the additional sites for that input, you really can have an optimal design, the right number of patients, and really have addressed those factors that can slow down your enrollment.
Thank you. So we've got a few minutes for questions. Not very many, but we have a few minutes for some questions that might have come up while we've been talking. So anybody raise your hand. Maybe a microphone will come by. Maybe not. Maybe you'll just have to scream it out, like I made that gentleman do in the back. Although your question was better the second time, I will say. Anyone at all? Sure.
A lot of time, actually, we have in the EMR, we don't have the ICD code, like a patient have to find, So we have to go through manually, see all patient consult report or lab or medication. Then we can go retroactively, and then we can find the patient, It's a wasting of time. And so is there anything we can filter more, precisely the patient inclusion, exclusion, and something?
Let me put that to the panel. What do you think?
Well, unfortunately, if it's not, if it's PDF, you're a little bit stuck on searching, right? And hopefully, with your familiarity, whatever the word is, with the system, you know where to look first. But maybe ask the IT person, right? Is there a way to extract at least some of that information to another format, right? Is there a more independent format that can come out of that system? Because a couple times we have been lucky with that, with a few sites where their EMR was not quite as evolved yet. So
we tried that several years ago, and at Arkansas Children's, and we had sort of a hybrid system. Some things were PDFs, and then some things that were reported from outside the institution that came in, they were in completely different file formats. And one of the issues that we ran into was allowing our IT guys access to medical records. Do you really want people that really have no, actual part in your clinical experience or care in your medical records. And then there's a yes and a no there. I mean, there's a part, there's a balance there, there's a risk there. But, you know, in answer to your question, they did find ways to pull things out of those records. But because it was not just easily searchable, the information you had to go back, you know, sometimes it didn't make any sense. You know, the things that came out weren't really what you were looking for, but it was reported back to
I
you.
usually look for the medication, and then I can find the.
Well, then you've got common names, and then you have other names. I mean, there's all sorts of different misspellings, you know, and it's hard. You know, you've got to be able to use some fuzzy logic as well as the digital kind. You were going to say?
I just have a funny story in that I can relate to that because
We like those. We like those.
we were working with a very large university in the southeast part of the United States, and the study coordinator had to fill out a form for the IT person to run a query to look for these patients in the database, and you know, it took a week or two to get it, and they had to do a requisition to get to the IT people to do this. And when he got his results finally, there were no patient identifiers, not a single initial, name, anything. So he had this huge list of qualified patients, but absolutely no way to figure out who these patients were. So you're right about the patient privacy worked. It did. So it was just, it was disastrous.
I had thought about reading all of y'all's bios and having them guess who they applied to, and I guess that's sort of the same thing. We really did talk about that in the car on the way over here, just to see. So are there any other questions? We got just a couple more minutes. So we've got one here and then one back over there.
So this is a question for Roger, but it's kind of circuitous in that I got involved with a client who had a problem in the phase 2 of his clinical trial, and it was 70% screen failure rate. And they needed some way to pre-screen. So when you mention pre-screening, the light bulbs go off in my head, you know, the alarms go off. Because they used pre-screening, they actually created an algorithm using a biophysiological test, actually 2 biophysiological tests, to separate patients out from phase 2 to phase 3, because you can imagine the cost of taking a 70% screen failure rate into phase 3. So I guess what I wanted to know was, Roger, what were your thoughts on this type of a strategy? What would you expect as far as an outcome if you added a clinical test, an actual biometric test, an analyte, to a study to separate patients out from a phase 2, from a phase 3?
Right. So are you talking about an analytical test at pre-screening?
Yeah, exactly, before enrollment.
Yeah, well, that's a tricky one. Usually, in my opinion, pre-screening is done, we often do it over the phone, you know. It's very important. You could make the criteria so loose you get thousands of people calling in. I actually was working at a clinical site one time, and I actually ran an ad on TV, and I was very unpopular because the next day the switchboard was jammed at the university. It's very important to get the conditions right up front, so you don't get too many patients, but you get enough. I don't know how to answer the question about different pre-screening criteria from going from phase 2 to phase 3. Obviously, I think it's probably broader in phase 3. Can anyone else add to that?
The only thing I was going to ask is more of a clarifying question, is that if this was an analytical test that wouldn't normally be in the patient's record, it'd be very difficult to do that prior to them signing informed consent, because you're asking them to do something for the purposes of the study. Yeah. So I think it's the only way that would be worthwhile and not worthwhile, executable would be, feasible, thank you, is if that was a test that that's just normally part of their care, that you could look in the database, ovarian cancer, it's CA125. If everyone's going to have that anyway, that's one thing. But if it's something that you're asking them to do to screen them out, that has to be part of screening after they sign informed consent, so you don't get that benefit.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And what was happening is that the clinicians were enrolling patients based on data that was somewhat dated, meaning they were 6-12 months out from the physiological data. The biophysiological data was old. And so going back to your point about just grabbing a bunch of data and looking at it, the cohort was essentially, insignificantly diminished by the fact that they didn't have recent data. So how do you take those same patients and then bring that up to date at a minimal cost? If you send them out to central lab, you're going to pay the highest price.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing you could do is you design the study in the order of assessments in such a way that they are eliminated based upon the cost of the assessment or the one that's the easiest to do. So if it's a simple test that is invasive, something that they wouldn't normally do, so therefore they need to sign informed consent, then you do that first. So you wouldn't do a PET scan before you do a blood test. So, that's sort of the way we just operate and proceed with these type of things. So, but I understand what you're saying about a data test, and I would just say that what the sponsor would do and build into their study is that they just do a repeat as the very first thing that they would do.
So what they decided to do was they did a finger stick test for an EGFR. So they got a serum creatinine and calculated the EGFR, and they created an algorithm for that. And then they took a patient's urine and they used a UACR, nothing more than a dipstick, and created an algorithm for that. And they said based on those two tests, they could eliminate patients that wouldn't fit the criteria. What they did and what we helped them actually execute, it was their idea. I can't take credit for actually coming up with the idea, but I helped them execute it, was they reduced their screen failure rate from 70% down underneath 50%. And again, it was a strategy that worked, and it was based on real data, as opposed to separating out, patients based on something that was based on maybe something off of their chart, but something real. And it was done at a cost less than $50 a test. So instead of sending it out to central lab, they were able to clear the patient on the same day that the patient was enrolled by a pre-screen and a consent form, so that they were able to create that environment. Again, their idea, we just helped them execute it. So there are strategies out there that can help reduce screen failures, and that's the biggest component of enrollment, is speed to enrollment and an executable enrollment that fits the criteria.
Certainly so. Fits the criteria. That's the key. There was a question over here. Could someone, thank you.
Thank you so much for the discussion. I think one of you mentioned a valid point that patients have loyalty to their physicians, and sometimes it's very hard to sort of break out of that to go to another site. Do you have any sort of advice for physicians or for the sites in terms of how they can overcome some of those barriers in terms of patient recruitment?
So one possibility, it kind of depends on proximity. If it happens to be, call it 50 miles or less away, and there's a clear referral network. So your investigator site is here, but they have these 5 physicians that commonly refer them, is to help them reach out. You can help them write letters to them. You can have a little meeting, where you bring them all together and have dinner and talk about the study, and so that the investigator as well as the referring physicians are all aware of the study, and to try to help leverage that network so that the referring physician is now thinking about you and your trial in the context of what might help their patients, and can say, okay, I know we have a great relationship, but here's a trial for you that might work. You have to drive 30 miles, but this is something that I think could be good for you. I think it's an easier, it's easier for patients to be interested in doing that if it comes from that referring physician, than if they're themselves having to pull away from their primary physician to go somewhere else. But if that physician suggests it, they might be more willing to be disloyal, I guess, for lack of a better word, because I think people have that emotional connection. But if that person says, "Hey, I think that's good for you," that might be one way to kind of overcome that.
I know that reaching out to advocacy groups also can help. I know that in the histiocytosis world, we're often asked, this very question about people who can treat or don't know how to treat histio, and it's a physician that they trust and they've seen for many years versus one that they may have to drive to a center, a university center to be seen and treated. So it's a good question. Thank you. We are properly out of time. We have until 8:30 an open bar, and I think that there's still some stuff to eat. So I want to thank the panel, and I want to thank all of you. Thank you very much for keeping it interactive.